On Thursday, the 10th of July, just last month, a 25-year-old man named Lazarus Howard III exchanged what would be his final known messages from his mother before he would mysteriously vanish without a trace. Lazarus, who lived alone in his Western Ranch apartment in Huntsville, had been in regular contact with his family, which made his sudden silence all the more alarming. So, after repeated calls and texts went unanswered, his mother made the 3-hour drive from Selma to Huntsville, only to discover that Lazarus had seemingly disappeared. A welfare check by police also revealed that there were no immediate signs of him inside his apartment, and investigators would later confirm that there was no evidence to show that he had ever returned home after the 10th of July. But with each passing day, the mystery surrounding his disappearance would only seem to deepen, after it was revealed that before Lazarus disappeared, he was planning to spend time with a group of friends, who to this day are still yet to come forward. So, after 1 month of investigating, Lazarus's case remains painfully unsolved, which has understandably left his family devastated, as they are only left to wonder, what really happened to Lazarus Howard? And who could be responsible for his strange and sudden disappearance? Lazarus Howard III, otherwise known as Shark by his close friends, was born in the year 2000 and raised in Alabama, where he grew up as part of a large, supportive family who always described him as kind and thoughtful. Known for his calm demeanour and dependable nature, Lazarus was someone who could be counted on by those around him. Friends and relatives often recalled his willingness to help others, and his family admired how grounded and approachable he remained, even as he grew older and began building a life of his own. Family played an important role in Lazarus's life, especially his close relationship with his mother, Erica. The two spoke regularly, sometimes even daily, sharing the kind of bond that gave her reassurance about his well-being. According to her, it was unusual for him to go long without responding to her messages. But by 2025, Lazarus was living in the Huntsville, Madison area at the Western Ranch Apartments, a community situated on Lawson Ridge Drive. He was at an age where he was finding independence, yet he never lost touch with the people who mattered to him most. Those closest to him say he had many plans for the future, and to his family he appeared steady, reliable, and, as always, in good spirits. However, that sense of stability would unexpectedly shatter when, for reasons unknown, Lazarus would mysteriously disappear on that fateful day in July. On Thursday, the 10th of July, the 25-year-old had exchanged what would become his final known messages with his mother, Erica, when on that particular evening she would send him a text that would go unanswered. At first, she assumed that he might have just been busy, but as the hours turned into days, her concern began to grow. For someone as consistent and reliable as Lazarus, complete silence was unusual, and as other family members began to notice the same pattern, red flags would soon emerge. By the following week, Erica decided to contact the Huntsville Police Department, where she asked them to perform a welfare check at his residence at the Western Ranch Apartments on Lawson Ridge Drive. When officers arrived, they attempted to make contact, but Lazarus never came to the door, and with no warrant or probable cause, they were forced to leave empty-handed. According to the police, there were no immediate signs of a disturbance from what they could see from the outside, but also no indication that he had been home for a considerable amount of time. By all accounts, Lazarus was also the proud owner of a pet cat, which he usually took excellent care of. So, given these concerning details, Erica then made the 3-hour drive from Selma to Huntsville, nearly 10 days after she had last heard from her son, and it was there that she would stand face to face with the unsettling quiet of his empty apartment. Just as the police had discovered, Erica could tell that Lazarus had clearly not visited his home in days, so with her concern beginning to boil over, she realized that the situation was far worse than she had hoped, which is when she would make the incredibly difficult decision to officially report her son as missing to the Huntsville police. On Saturday, the 19th of July, exactly 9 days after Erica had last spoken to her son, the Huntsville Police Department would receive that haunting call where it was revealed that Lazarus had continued to remain silent despite his family's persistent attempts to contact him. So, responding to Erica's pleas, investigators opened a case and began gathering as much information as possible about Lazarus's last known whereabouts. One of the first steps involved was performing another welfare check at his apartment to see if there had been any further evidence to show he had returned. However, just as before, the police were met with the very same vacant home that they had seen in the previous check, so once again they were left empty-handed. But as the days passed, detectives continued building a timeline by speaking with family members and neighbours, while also monitoring his residence for any signs of activity. But despite their efforts, no evidence would emerge to suggest that Lazarus had returned to his apartment, nor were there any indications of his movements elsewhere in the Huntsville-Madison area. By mid-August, with weeks now gone by and still no sightings, the case grew more troubling, as Huntsville police investigators confirmed publicly that they had still found no evidence that Lazarus had ever come back home after July 10th, with neighbours providing statements that the home had been untouched for the entire period. And with no leads or sightings, investigators and loved ones were left to confront the most chilling possibility of all, that Lazarus could be in serious danger. So at this point, the police then decided to expand their search into the Selma and Central Alabama area, as Sergeant Chris Jackson would reveal. We know from talking to family that he's from Selma, and he may have returned there, so we're hoping we can speak with people that are in that area. However, unbeknownst to the investigating officers, it would be upon having these conversations that a new piece of evidence would quickly come to light that would significantly alter the timeline of the young man's disappearance. On Tuesday, the 19th of August, 40 days since anyone had heard from Lazarus, his case had begun to draw significant public and media attention, with local news outlets offering their support to the family. On this particular day, WHNT News 19 reported on the desperate pleas of his family, who sat before cameras as they urged the community to help bring Lazarus home. His mother Erica tearfully expressed the anguish of not knowing what had happened to her son, emphasizing that his sudden disappearance was completely out of character and begging anyone with information to come forward. But this coverage would also reveal a new detail about the case, which Erica was previously unaware of, that during the course of the investigation, the Huntsville Police Department had uncovered that Lazarus had actually spoken to a friend on the 11th of July, which was the day after he was last reportedly seen. According to Sergeant Chris Jackson, it was a good friend of his, and there was nothing suspicious of their conversation in any way. Lazarus was just going to hang out with some other friends and quickly got off the phone. But despite the lack of red flags in this conversation, it further reiterated the fact that Lazarus had been completely silent for weeks, with even close friends having no idea where he could be. So the coverage of his story quickly began to spread beyond local broadcasts, with community members sharing Lazarus's story widely across social media in the hopes of reaching someone who may have held a missing piece of the puzzle. Hashtags tied to his name began to circulate, and neighbours organised online groups dedicated to raising awareness and supporting the family's search for answers. Meanwhile, Huntsville police confirmed what many had already feared, that despite repeated welfare checks and continuous monitoring, there was still no evidence that Lazarus had ever returned to his apartment after July 10th, and this chilling detail reinforced the urgency of his family's public appeals and cast further doubt on the possibility that his absence had been voluntary. But while the spotlight had certainly brought his case into sharper public view, it also underscored the frustrating lack of progress. Detectives continued to comb through leads and re-interview those connected to him, yet each avenue seemed to circle back to the same dead end. And so, even with mounting media coverage and a community rallying behind his loved ones, the harsh truth unfortunately remains, as to this day, Lazarus Howard III is still missing, with his family left waiting in agony for answers that continue to elude them. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. Despite weeks of searching, welfare checks, and the efforts of detectives, Lazarus's disappearance remains as mysterious today as it was on July 10th. For his family, the lack of answers has been agonizing, but they continue to speak out in interviews and appeal to the community, holding on to hope that someone somewhere has information that could finally bring him home. To them, it's not just a matter of if the truth will be uncovered, but when. However, with more than a month now gone since his last confirmed contact, and with no evidence to suggest where he might be, the chances of finding Lazarus safe and alive have only grown more uncertain as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, as always, just before we get into the theories themselves, I feel it's important to acknowledge the immense pain and uncertainty that his family have been forced to endure during this difficult period. So out of respect for them, I will do my best to approach these possibilities with as much empathy and sensitivity as possible, and I will only be covering ideas that stem from statements made by Lazarus's family, as well as information released by law enforcement. Also, while some theories may appear more likely than others, we must remember that until concrete evidence emerges, they remain nothing more than speculation. But with that being said, one of the most widely considered explanations for what happened to Lazarus is the possibility that he was a victim of foul play. From the very beginning, his mother has been adamant that his disappearance was highly out of character. She described her son as someone she spoke with regularly, stressing that he would never voluntarily cut off all contact without a word. To her, the sudden silence was an immediate red flag, and she has repeatedly voiced her belief that something must have happened to him. This concern is only amplified by the police revelation that Lazarus never returned to his apartment after July 10th. For investigators, that detail has been crucial, as it suggests that whatever took place may have occurred shortly after his phone call with his mother. The absence of evidence at his home also raises troubling questions. If he didn't come back that night, then where did he go, and who might he have been with? The police did reveal that Lazarus had spoken to a friend the day after he disappeared, but all we know is that he was apparently going to stay with some friends, with no further information about who those friends were or what they had planned. The family has also openly pleaded with the community, expressing confidence that Lazarus is still somewhere in the Huntsville, Madison area, and strongly believing that someone could be holding him against his will. Their insistence that someone out there knows something has only fueled suspicion that his disappearance may not have been a voluntary act at all. So while no suspects have been named and no arrests have been made, the unsettling lack of clues, combined with his family's certainty that he would not simply walk away from his life, has led many to consider that foul play could be at the centre of this mystery. But if this is the case, then who could be responsible? Well, an idea that has been heavily discussed online involves the friends that Lazarus was planning to meet on the night of July 11th. According to the Huntsville police, Lazarus's final known conversation was with one of his close friends, and investigators stressed at the time that there was nothing unusual or alarming about the exchange. In fact, officers described it as a brief, casual conversation, so on the surface this might have seemed like an entirely ordinary situation. However, the circumstances that followed have raised some troubling questions. If Lazarus had left with the intention of meeting friends, then why has no one come forward to clarify what happened that night? This silence has led to speculation about whether Lazarus may have encountered danger at the hands of people he trusted, with one possibility being that an argument may have escalated unexpectedly, resulting in an impulsive act that was quickly covered up. Another theory is that Lazarus could have been lured into a dangerous situation under false pretenses, otherwise known as a honeypot, and after meeting with these so-called friends, he was met with an intentional and orchestrated act of foul play. Others wonder if his disappearance might have had ties to gang activity or some kind of retaliation, possibilities that can't yet be ruled out given the lack of clear evidence. But whatever the case may be, the fact still remains that Lazarus was last heard from while on his way to meet these friends, and yet no concrete information has surfaced about what happened afterward. So this gap in the timeline continues to trouble both investigators and his family, leaving them to wonder if the answers to Lazarus's disappearance might lie within that very group of people he was supposed to see. But of course, without any hard evidence, this theory can only remain speculative, so before we jump to any conclusions, we must take a moment to consider the other possibilities. So, if for argument's sake, foul play wasn't involved, then what else could explain his strange disappearance? Well, investigators have also acknowledged the possibility that Lazarus may have chosen to disappear voluntarily, as this is an idea that often arises in missing person cases where there is little to no physical evidence. Some might speculate that personal pressures or even an undisclosed desire to start over could have led him to walk away from his life without telling anyone. However, his mother Erica has continued to emphasize from the start that she wholeheartedly believes that he would never simply cut off contact, especially not for this long. For his family, the silence is completely uncharacteristic, and they insist that if Lazarus had been facing any struggles, he would not have just kept them entirely hidden. This theory is further challenged by the circumstances of his disappearance, as police confirmed that Lazarus has still not returned to his apartment despite knowing he has a cat at home that he needs to look after. So his absence suggests that something far more troubling may have happened. If he had decided to leave voluntarily, investigators would likely expect to see some trace of his movements, yet weeks have now passed with no activity or sightings of the young man. So while a voluntary disappearance cannot be entirely ruled out, it seems inconsistent with what is known about Lazarus's character and his relationships. For his family, the idea that he would choose to abandon them without a word feels far less likely than the possibility that something prevented him from coming back. So, after taking all this evidence into consideration, if Lazarus didn't leave by choice, then what else could have happened to him? Well, another theory that is always quietly considered in cases like these is the possibility that Lazarus may have simply been the victim of an accident or misadventure that could have tragically resulted in the unexpected loss of his life. In situations where someone suddenly disappears without a trace, investigators always consider this as an option, because it isn't uncommon that after months of searching, a case can be solved by finding a body in some kind of remote location. In fact, on this channel I have covered several missing person cases that have ended in this very way, such as the recent disappearance of Giovanni Pelletier, whose body was eventually found lifeless in a local pond, close to where he had last been seen. In Giovanni's case, his cause of death is still yet to be determined, but police are insistent that there are no signs of foul play, alluding to the fact that his death was nothing more than a tragic accident. For Lazarus, some have speculated that he could have suffered an accident in circumstances where no one was present to help him, but so far in the investigation, there has been absolutely no evidence to corroborate this idea, leading his family to understandably dispute the theory. In most cases of accident or misadventure, some kind of trace is usually discovered, like surveillance footage or a piece of clothing. Yet in Lazarus's case, investigators have found nothing, which is either a sign that he is still out there somewhere laying low, or his remains have been hidden in an attempt to evade discovery. But no matter how you look at it, the absence of evidence makes the accidental death theory difficult to sustain, and for his loved ones, it only strengthens their belief that someone else may be withholding vital information. However, regardless of what the evidence seems to show, until more information is revealed, we can only continue to speculate on what truly happened that day. So while we wait for this case to be solved, I urge you to please show your support to Lazarus's family, and make sure to share this story to help spread awareness, as with the help of the community, it will surely only be a matter of time before his family get the answers that they so desperately deserve. But just before I end the video, there was one last discussion point that I wanted to personally raise, as in all honesty, this story has really struck a nerve with me given its similarities to another case I thoroughly investigated a few months ago, about a victim named Ronald Dumas Jr. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this case, I will just provide a quick rundown of the details to give you some context. On Sunday the 15th of December in 2024, a 37-year-old real estate agent named Ronald Dumas Jr. was last seen exiting a liquor store in Huntsville, Alabama, before his black SUV would be found mysteriously abandoned the next day on a stretch of highway in Tennessee. At first, police insisted there was no signs of foul play, claiming that his car may have just broken down and that he'd likely walked off in search of help. But despite these claims, his family were adamant that Ronald would never disappear on his own, and as the investigation progressed, their worst fears began to emerge after it was revealed that the police had searched his vehicle 3 times without involving crime scene investigators until the final attempt, possibly contaminating crucial evidence. But to make matters even worse, after nearly 2 months of silence, the case would suddenly take a shocking turn when authorities announced that Ronald may have been abducted, with 5 suspects being linked to the case. However, despite uncovering these terrifying details, after 9 months of investigating, we are still awaiting a verdict from the police on what really happened that day, which feels hauntingly familiar when you compare this case to the disappearance of Lazarus Howard, as there are some glaring similarities that, in my opinion, are certainly worth exploring. Firstly, both Lazarus and Ronald were young black men deeply connected to their families, with bright futures still ahead of them. Neither had any history of simply walking away from their lives, which makes their sudden disappearances all the more troubling. And while the circumstances are different, there are some unsettling parallels that cannot be ignored. For one, both men vanished in Huntsville within 7 months of each other, and in both cases, law enforcement was left with only fragments of information to work with. Lazarus was last heard from after exchanging messages with his mother, with no sign he ever returned home, while Ronald was last seen entering a liquor store before his vehicle was later discovered abandoned across state lines, and in each instance, the trail went cold almost immediately. But the similarities don't stop there, as in both cases there have been concerns raised over delays in the police response, as well as questions about whether these investigations were truly prioritized in the critical early days. And then, of course, comes the uncomfortable but necessary question of racial bias. Far too often, families of missing black men have spoken out about their struggles to be taken seriously, and both Lazarus's and Ronald's families have had to fight to keep their loved ones' cases in the public eye. The lack of consistent media coverage, combined with the slow investigative updates, has only reinforced the painful feeling that their cases risk falling through the cracks. So, when we place these 2 stories side by side, it becomes clear that these are not just isolated tragedies, but instead they form part of a troubling pattern, one where young black men can disappear under mysterious circumstances only for their cases to face delays or minimal public attention. And until that pattern is acknowledged and addressed, the fear remains that more families will be left without answers. Because behind both Lazarus and Ronald are families who are grieving and holding on to hope. And it's up to us to make sure that their stories are heard, so they do not become just another pair of names added to a list of unsolved cases. Anyway, on that note, I think I'll leave this video here. But as always, if you have any other theories of your own, which you think may help explain what really happened to Lazarus Howard, please leave your ideas in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Also, for those of you who want to help this channel grow so we can help spread even more awareness for these types of cases, consider becoming a member today for less than $1 a month, as these contributions will help me keep the channel afloat when views are low. And if we get enough members, I hope to one day be able to give back to the families themselves to help fund their searches. But either way, until next time, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to check out the playlist on screen now, which covers the many other cases of young black men who continue to go missing in recent years.